One. Welcome everybody to our SASA Live Book Club. Today we are joined by Tim Brookes, the author of Writing Beyond Writing, Lessons from Endangered Alphabets. And I'm super excited to get started. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim.
My pleasure, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to put up a little slideshow and talk about briefly what SASA is and why we're here today, and then we're going to jump straight into the questions. So let me share my screen. Righty, and let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so again, we are here with Tim Brookes to talk about his book, Writing Beyond Writing. SASA is a nonprofit organization on a mission to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement and promote engagement with our human deeper past. So we're building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. And we work toward our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students and readers too. I'm going to add that. We are pretty much on every social media platform. So if you are interested in helping us save ancient studies, please follow us on our platforms, and also live event protocol. So just be kind and respectful, listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the events. This is a pre-recorded live session. So please post comments on the platform where you're watching us, and we will answer those questions as quickly as we can. Thank you for joining us on those platforms. If you want to become a recurring donor for SASA, you can help us at this link right here, saveancientstudies.org. And yeah, so let's jump into it. Okay, so can you tell us briefly what your book is about and what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, I have to track back a little bit. So the whole thing really starts around 2009, when, for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with anything you might expect, I began doing two different things at the same time. I began teaching myself wood carving and carving pieces of text from endangered alphabets. And then, as I was doing that, I started getting curious about them and researching. So the first, 5 years of the Endangered Alphabets Project was me doing these carvings. And in fact, I've got some examples here I can hold up so that your folks can see. So this would be one. This is about, of course, now you can't see my face.
That's beautiful, though. Oh my goodness.
Um, and this was the kind of stuff I was doing. I can tell you more about that in a minute. And then I was also giving exhibitions and talking about this whole issue that nobody knew anything about. Literally nobody. I was the only person in the world doing it, which is, we've heard of endangered species, we've heard of endangered languages, but what I was talking about was endangered alphabets, and it was such a new concept that I would say something about endangered alphabets, and people would respond talking about endangered languages. Um, and that was sort of the first phase. The second phase was when I went to Bangladesh, um, actually doing some public health work for another project, and met people from minority communities in the Chittagong Hill Tracts whose alphabets were endangered. And this really brought home to me how this comes about and what effect it has, because these are indigenous peoples who've lived and farmed these upland areas for generations upon generations upon generations. And essentially, their land was being taken away from them by the government and given to kind of mainstream culture settlers. And what this meant was that the kids from these communities, these very rural upland communities, spoke their own language at home, but when they went to schools, which are funded by the government, they were taught in the national language with the national script. They had never seen their own scripts. And so I worked with a wonderful guy from that area, and we started creating educational materials in these languages and in these scripts for the kids. So they were starting to have proper mother tongue education. So that really became that kind of turned me into much more of an activist. And I started working with a variety of peoples from around the world. Um, and that led to people asking me at talks that I would give, this is really important. This is fascinating. Where can I find out more about it? And there really wasn't anywhere. And so I created an atlas of endangered alphabets. And that was originally an online thing, and it still is. Subsequently, and just very recently, it's become a print book. So you can now buy the print edition of the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets. What had happened confusingly was I was already working on the next book, which was Writing Beyond Writing. And for that book, and now we finally, after all this backstory, come up to date. So I imagined myself like an explorer, a 19th century explorer. So I've been out around the world. I've come back to either the Royal Geographical Society or the Explorers Club. And I'm, in New York, and I have like a magic lantern slide that I'm giving, and 150 people have crowded into the room to see all of this stuff. And I imagined somebody, either like a retired colonel or some kind of starchy matron, like rapping on the wooden floor with a stick and saying, Mr. Brookes, all of this is very well and very interesting, but what has it taught you about writing itself? So that's when I started moving from saying, here are all of these fascinating cultures with their own writing systems, and this is how they came about, and this is why they're marginalized, etc. And I started thinking, what does this tell us about writing itself? Because what it really tells us is that our own understanding of writing and our definitions and our prejudices are entirely based on a kind of a Eurocentric model, because nobody, virtually nobody, had ever really been out to the places that I'd been to, again, virtually, to see what writing was like when it was very different. And what is more, if such people had gone out, they would tend to say, this is not writing at all, or this is some unevolved form of writing that hasn't yet reached the status and stage of development of our writing, which is not only elitist, but borderline racist in many ways. And what's more, it shows both how we continue to impose our ideas of what writing is on the rest of the world, and our ideas are so narrow and so limited. And writing is so much more and so much more interesting than what we carry around in here.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned you wrote it like you were an explorer, and that I felt like I was exploring it too. Like the way you wrote the book, you did it so well, and I couldn't put it down, to be honest. Like I was just like, what's the next thing? Like it was fascinating to me, and I love all the different things that you explored in there. And yeah, so let me move on to my next question. So you mentioned that the evolution of language, this idea that not only that only higher evolved civilizations develop systems of writing. It's actually not about humans becoming more evolved, but about which culture has the biggest military.
Yeah.
Can you talk about this a little bit in more detail, especially as it pertains to the Latin alphabet becoming the dominant alphabet?
Yeah, very much so. So what what it's hard for us now to realize is the logic and thinking and supposed scholarship that went on for the last, say, 300 years in our own academies, in our own thinking populations, because underlying everything was the assumption that we were superior in every respect because we are superior, not because our armies went out and overran people who didn't have gunpowder or stuff like that. And so consequently, there is this kind of reverse logic that developed, which is if we are superior, and this is the form of writing we use, this must be the form of writing of that is superior. And in fact, there were quite serious arguments put forward that said that um, abstract thought was only possible in an alphabet that descended from Greek because the Greeks invented abstract thought and because the letters are not in any way depictions of anything. So the thinking was if you have a letter that is, let's say it's an S and it's shaped like a snake, then anybody who uses it is going to be thinking of snakes when they look at an S, right? You have a writing system that is just essentially an assemblage of pictures. And that was, of course, when the Spanish arrived in Central and South America and they saw the Mayan script, all they saw was a set of pictures, which, of course, is a massive misreading of Mayan script. And
Okay.
likewise, when they looked at Egyptian, they're like, oh, yes, they're just pictures. Therefore, writing evolves out of pictures. The joke, well, there are the many reasons why this is such a ridiculous argument. Part of it is that actually the Phoenician alphabet, out of which the Greek alphabet developed, actually has letters that are the shapes of things. So the A was exactly like the head of an ox because Aleph, you've got the ox, you've got the A for Aleph, and then when it gets turned around and it looks this way, it no longer looks like the head of an ox, it looks like an A. But originally it was a circle with horns pointing up. And likewise, meme was wiggly lines meaning river. So, you've got a meandering river. But because the word changed and it no longer looked like, an R, for example, it was assumed that this was an abstract symbol that had been created by a superior and evolved people because they wanted abstract symbols. So or there are many other reasons why this argument is total baloney. One of which is that this argument was used against the Chinese. And it was like because they saw Chinese as a pictographic script, which it isn't. And they said, so therefore the Chinese are not evolved. They haven't evolved to the point of using a phonetic alphabet. And Confucius, was writing philosophy when people in Northern Europe were still painting themselves blue with woad and throwing sticks and stones at each other. So it's a totally bogus self-supporting argument. And it gets reinforced every time there is any kind of action of dominance, whether it be a military excursion, whether it be a financial or a technological expansion from the West. It continues that therefore this should happen in the Latin alphabet. And of course, the fact that the internet, the coding, is almost exclusively in the Latin alphabet is another kind of invasion or exvasion, maybe, by the Latin alphabet. And I have this saying, everyone's heard the phrase history is written by the winners. And I say history is written by the winners in the alphabet of the winners.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I just read a book it was called History of Ancient Rome in 12 Coins. And they were talking about how Carthage was this huge superpower that challenged Rome for, decades.
Yep.
And when Rome finally conquered them, they obliterated everything, their alphabet, their language, all their documents, this gigantic library that they had there. They just burned it all. And
Yeah.
now we have no trace of any writing
Yeah.
from Carthage now because of that. And so when I read that in your book, it reminded me of that other book that I read. And I was like, wow, that's on point. Like
Yeah.
it's
It's absolutely true. If one culture conquers another, then their immediate priority is to make sure there isn't some kind of counterinsurgency. And so the ways that they do that vary, but they tend to be instant and brutal and also directed against the people most likely to lead some kind of counterinsurgency. So when um, Archbishop de Landa carried out his auto da fe against the Mayans, in addition to burning every Mayan codex or book he could find and destroying as many of the physical stone evidences of Mayan writing, he also tortured the Mayan nobility in horrific ways. And you think, well, these are two different things, but no, they're actually very much two different sides of the same, if you'll excuse me, coin. Um, and the savagery that we see in one is a sign of um, the kind of the savagery in implicit in the other. We don't see burning books as a savage thing. We see it as kind of an outrage. But the fact that it was part of this whole obliteration. Same thing happened when the king of Vietnam overran the Champa, which was this kingdom in what would now be central Vietnam. So Champa was both Hindu and Muslim. And in addition to destroying Cham or documents written in Cham, he forced the Muslims of the conquered people to eat pork and the Hindus to eat beef. And so it's all a way of like breaking their spirit to the point where they're kind of going, well, we might as well just go along with them because we don't have a choice.
yeah, that's heartbreaking. It kind of goes into my next question that I have though, because so you mentioned that our own script, the English Latin alphabet, is so universal that it has virtually no identification with our own culture, which the flip side of that is that the more endangered scripts are an identity of their culture. And by destroying that, you destroy that identity and force them to assimilate. But can you talk a little bit more about how endangered languages and scripts are different and how they speak to the identity of these marginalized cultures?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, just so to go back to your first point, um, it's very hard for us even to understand what a unique script means to the people who are the only people who use it, because ours is so universal. We can sort of understand it if you make an analogy with language. And so, if you're, for example, Breton or if you're Catalan, then you may be, or Welsh, you may be very proud of and fiercely defend your right to use your own language. Even if you don't necessarily speak it, you see it as being a critical, intangible cultural element. Um, However, if you're from Brittany or Spain or Wales, you all use pretty much the same alphabet. So the idea that the same passion and the same essential quality might apply to scripts in other cultures. And especially as so much of language and script dissemination across the world has been carried out by missionaries who really see it as their mission to convert all the peoples of the world for their own good. Then you start realizing that for them to say, oh, look, we're going to introduce you to the Latin alphabet, and we're going to print Bibles and prayer books so that you can sing along with us and all this kind of thing. It's all part of the same piece. And it all comes from assuming the basic assumption that some people are better than others, and that therefore they have the right to impose their ideas or thoughts on others because they're better. It's for their own good, kind of thing. Um, and in that sense, endangered languages and endangered alphabets or scripts are two kind of overlapping, they're like the MasterCard symbol, the Venn diagram. There are some places where both the language and the script are endangered. If we were to say Cherokee in 1980. So the Cherokee language is spoken by very few people at that point. The Cherokee script is used by even fewer. Now they're both, pretty robustly in a revival process. If you look at what happened in Indonesia after World War II, you have the Indonesian War of Independence, you have the creation of this new nation of Indonesia, which is 17,000 islands, 6 major religions, fifth largest population in the world. So the question becomes, how do we create a sense of national unity? And so the first thing the government did, one of the first things the government did, was to say, we're going to have a national language. And we're going to, which was essentially Malay, and we're going to write it in the Latin alphabet because that's the kind of the world alphabet. And so what happened was that almost immediately in schools throughout Indonesia, where kids had been learning to write in the Javanese script or the Balinese script or any of the other more than 20 scripts of the islands, they now started learning the Latin alphabet. They would continue to speak their own language for quite some time because it's to have a national language which you use for official purposes and then another language you use at home is not that uncommon. It's a relatively stable state. But in terms of scripts, what you're taught in school, what you use for official purposes tends to dominate much more quickly. And so when I first started the Endangered Alphabets Project in 2009, it took me a year to find somebody who could read and write the Balinese script and could give me a piece of text that I could carve.
That's awesome. I just thinking about that is wild. It's wild. So that directly goes into my next point, which we kind of already touched on a little bit, but one of your main points is that language rights are human rights. Can you explain what this means and especially how it pertains to endangered languages and alphabets?
Yeah. So you're talking about Carthage a little while ago. So in that period of time, which is basically, we'll say 200 BCE, you have a North African population which is geopolitically very, very different than it is today. You have the Amazigh people, which is a sort of a collection of related cultures who are somewhat nomadic, but live all the way from the Canary Islands to Western Egypt, all the way across what is now the northern part of North Africa. Very much desert dwellers, as well as kind of coastal dwellers. And they get overrun bit by bit by the Romans, and then most dramatically by the Arabs, who essentially sweep all the way across and establish themselves as the models of government, but also of learning. I mean, it's true, the Arabs were an extraordinarily advanced civilization in terms of mathematics and astronomy and all sorts of things. But this meant that the Amazigh were marginalized and were treated as being backward, kind of primitive. And it also typically means, in times like this, that the conquerors take all the best land, the most fertile land. And we actually have relics, especially large stelae or stones, with writing that was used by the Amazigh 2,000 years ago, many of which have only been dug up relatively recently. So the Arabs and then subsequently the French colonized this whole area. And all this time, the Amazigh, who typically are called Berber, which is sort of an insult because it means barbarian, they remain perennial outsiders. And so when the countries of northern Africa are established, so we have Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, etc., the Amazigh are never represented. They're never part of the government. They're seen as being desert dwellers and village dwellers and backward people. Now, what that means is that if two significant people in Arab society hear a group of Amazigh people talking in one of a family of Amazigh languages, they don't know what they're talking about. They could be plotting. Likewise, if there is a message written in their script, it's like the Navajo code talkers. It's incomprehensible, and therefore it's a potential threat. And so in a number of countries, especially Algeria, they had a whole lot of rules about forbidding public gatherings, for example, of more than, I think it was 3 people, and communicating in Amazigh. And just to give you an illustration of how contemporary this is, yesterday on Twitter, I saw an account by a Korean American young woman who is talking on the phone to her sister in Korea and is talking in Korean. And a white woman of the kind typically called Karen these days yells at her, "Why don't you speak English?" At which point, this woman puts her phone down and swears at the woman in perfect English, So it's very much part of the same spirit that you're a threat because you're not doing what we want you to do. And of course, the extended threat is if there's enough of you, you're going to take away our jobs, you're going to eat our cats, or whatever. It's a familiar insanity. So the rules don't change. At the kind of the high end is the kind of the British Raj belief that we're doing you good by having you learn English and giving you jobs in our administration. At the low end, you have we're going to break your spirit and torture you or make you eat, beef or pork. So spoken language is part of that. Written language has a slightly different place in that it becomes a visual icon. And so when the Amazigh people eventually achieved a certain degree of self-determination, especially in Morocco, more recently to some degree in Algeria, they created their own flag. And in the heart of the flag is a letter. And the letter is the letter Yaz, which is one of the letters in their alphabet. And the reason it's there is because that letter can be seen in those stones 2,000 years old. So what it says is, we were here first. We've been here all along. We're going to put that on our flag as a visual icon of our history, our tradition, our culture.
Absolutely love that. And this brings to mind this whole discussion too, something even more recently in the United States with the Indian boarding schools and how
Mhm.
they prevented the Native American children from speaking their language and trying to take that right away from them and erase that cultural identity and that heritage from them, which is just heartbreaking to hear, some of the accounts of people who went through that.
Yep.
It's absolutely horrible. And you also mentioned in your book, I believe it was India, where they have so many different scripts on is it the monetary system? And if your script is on there, then you're recognized as an official um, ethnicity in the country. Is that right? So if your script doesn't make it, if it doesn't make the cut, then you're kind of like the lowest of the low citizens.
Um, yes. So India is a fascinating place linguistically, and as a result, there's a lot that we have to learn from them. So every time there is a survey of how many languages are spoken in India, the number goes up. So it's somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. Um, and one of the reasons why um, that number goes up is because there are individual ethno-linguistic groups who have either been driven or retreated so far away from civilization or have fallen so far beneath the radar that they wouldn't be included in a survey. So, for example, you talked about the lowest of the low. Um, there is a script that I just came across called Pariah, um, which was um, created just a couple of years ago by a young man who was a member of the Untouchables caste. So these are the cleaners and the rickshaw pullers um, and what was fascinating to me about this was the account that was written in an Indian newspaper about them talked about it as a mystery language and a mystery script. And what that really means is that we don't talk to these people anyway. So why would we know anything about their language? And it was revolutionary, therefore, in many ways, that this kid came up with a script for writing their language. And of course, Indian linguists were like, we didn't know that they didn't have a script before because we never thought to ask them because we don't talk to people like that kind of thing.
Wow, that is fascinating. And also just so outside of the realm of anything that I could even imagine being real, to be
Yeah.
honest. But
On
that's
the flip side of that is that your average educated Indian grows up using three or four different scripts every day. And so their understanding of written language is infinitely more adaptable and sophisticated than ours. So I've been doing these endangered alphabets things now for 15 years. I cannot read or write any of these scripts. And I did an informal survey to find out um, if you grew up using one script, did you find it harder to learn a second one? than if you grew up using 3 or 4 scripts and had to learn another one after that. Even if it was one from somewhere very different in the world. Say, for example, you grow up in India, you know multiple Indian scripts, you get a job in Abu Dhabi and you learn Arabic. It's like, yeah, that's no big deal. You just look at the symbols and you figure out how it works. Um, and it's no surprise that many of the people I work with who are absolutely at the forefront of exploring and understanding and researching scripts, written languages, are from South Asia.
That's interesting. So did you find in that so you found in the survey that people who did grow up using multiple scripts, they found it easier to learn
Yeah.
another one?
Yeah. I would not put any stock by the statistical exactitude of my survey, but it would be one worth doing properly, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, okay. So I think we covered the next question I had, which was you said endangered scripts inherently suggest suppression and annihilation of minorities and indigenous groups. And then can you explain this in more detail and how this threat not only has ancient implications, but also present day? Do you have anything else you want to add to that? Because I think we've covered that question,
Yeah,
but
I mean, it's happening. It's always happened and it's happening all the time.
yeah, absolutely. So one of the individuals you mentioned in your book, and I'm going to butcher his name because I'm part of the problem. Abule said that government communication is provided in a language that more than 75% of the people don't understand. And this is in his country.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't want them to understand the laws because they want to govern the people in a certain way, aka don't want people to be aware of their rights. Do you feel like these ramifications are relevant for cultures using the Latin alphabet as well? And when I read that, my head immediately went to the convoluted language that's used on voting ballots and US laws,
Yep.
which I'm sure is not unique to America, but I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, just to become even more current, um, the fact that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence have been taken off government websites in the last week is a perfect illustration of um, taking away the right of knowledge, for example, so that no one can say it says in the Constitution this and you're doing something different. Um, and in fact, I'm going to spring a sideways leap on you right now because I'm now working on my next book, um, which is about um, it's about the role and the value of handwriting in a very general sense, and it looks at the fact that in some of the cultures that I studied, the endangered alphabet type cultures, one of the things that's happening is that people are reintroducing or revitalizing their culture script by teaching calligraphy. And what that does is to not only does it do the whole hand-eye skills and all that kind of thing, fine motor skills, it connects people with their past and their heritage and their culture. What's happening in the West is exactly the opposite, where handwriting is being regarded as a lost art as everything becomes digitized. And so while I'm in the middle of doing this, the Smithsonian puts out this appeal to anybody who can read cursive to be a citizen volunteer to read the millions of documents they have that are handwritten that the what's called optical character recognition can't read. And so they actually need real people, but real people who can read cursive and therefore probably write cursive, which means, generally speaking, people above a certain age. So I thought this would be a great exercise for my book. So I sign up to do this. And the one of the specimens they give you in the training video, an example of document, is documents that have to do with internment of the Japanese during World War II. And I'm thinking, this is a perfect illustration of the kind of document that the government might well want to say did not exist. Because here you have actual written evidence of this kind of cultural genocide that takes place, an ethnic cleansing that's taking place. But here's the thing, because of our investment in digital writing tools instead of handwriting, these documents are now becoming legible and comprehensible to a shrinking number of people anyway. And so this is what I refer to as the digital divide, where you have this paradox where you have one generation of people who can read this stuff, but are not comfortable with the digital tools necessary to digitize it. And you have another generation that's perfectly comfortable with those digital tools, but can't read the stuff. And this is totally the flip side of an email, which I quote in Writing Beyond Writing, which was an email I got from a young Javanese woman who said that she had found these letters from her grandfather who had fought in the Indonesian War of Independence. And she really wanted to read them to find out what he did and what it was like and all this kind of thing. But she didn't read Javanese because the script was, dropped after World War II. So she's now relearning Javanese to learn about her family, her grandfather, what it was like then, what it's like to be part of a struggle to be a nation rather than a colony rather. And so that's a really great example of progress backwards that is integrative, as opposed to progress forwards, which is divisive, which is what we have invested in.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so that kind of leads into my next question is, so you had a little blurb on like futuristic ways of communication. And you mentioned text and social media as challenging these pop culture futuristic ideas defined by Star Trek and the like, that writing would become an obsolete form of communication.
Yeah.
Um, so out of curiosity, how do you think AI is going to impact messaging and communication? There's a lot of controversy surrounding AI. And what are your thoughts on it, especially when I'll get to the second part of that
Okay.
question. First part is what are your thoughts on AI?
So I really need to kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about three steps beyond handwriting. So, um, obviously, the default form of writing for most people up until extremely recently was writing by hand. Um, Starting in China about 1,000 years ago, starting in Europe about 5.5 centuries ago, you get the introduction of printing. Printing actually has relatively little effect on um, the prevalence or the practice of writing by hand. In fact, actually, even books are written by hand for centuries after the invention of printing. Um, Then you get the digital revolution, which essentially is starting in the mid 1980s. It doesn't really get going until the introduction of phones, in the late 90s. Um, and there you have this revolution where instead of having a device on your desk in your office that you use for business communication, because don't forget, international IBM was international business machines, right? All the first typewriters were intended for business. They weighed up to 40 pounds, so they're not going to be a threat to somebody sitting at home writing a letter. So it's not until you get devices that are cheap enough and portable enough and suitable for personal use that you get people starting to move personal correspondence from by hand to into a text form in which you have not formed the individual letters and you have no physical presence in the product. So all of those and that shift is really what I'm focusing on in this book that's about, calligraphy and handwriting and digitization. And in a way, all of that was rising until roughly probably 18 months ago when you suddenly have the AI spike, where what changes there is that you're going from people who are doing writing using a digital device to people who are not even doing the writing. And it's happening so fast that it's ahead of the research. But research I saw just yesterday showing that, and this was research carried out by Carnegie Mellon University, that people who use AI for their communications essentially become less mentally adept at problem solving and understanding complex issues and, the robot does it for you kind of thing.
I read that same article and I was like, huh, who would have thought?
And my answer to that is that this comes back to your understanding of what writing is. And one of the weird things that changed, um, and it's actually implicit in the Star Trek thing you mentioned. So in again, this you're talking about a section in Writing Beyond Writing where I say, how did people imagine the future? How did people imagine what writing would be like in the future or communication? And in all of these futuristic depictions, from the 30s onwards, nobody's writing. Everybody is doing face-to-face communication through wrist radios and viewer screens and stuff like that. And it's as if there is this implicit belief that writing is a chore. And the purpose of technology is going to be to take that chore off our shoulders. Now, in many cultures in the world, writing is not seen as a chore. It's actually seen as a form of meditation, a an adjunct to a spiritual ceremony, a means of connecting with the divine. But because our understanding of writing is writing as a chore, and the solution is all of these various tools that we're going to invent for you, we are accelerating the invasion of one point of view with another. And so the book that I'm writing right now, I'm actually writing it by hand. I'm writing it in handwriting, and it's going to get published in handwriting.
I love
And
that.
it's so interesting because everybody I talk to said, "That's great. How good is your handwriting?" Because there's the question, can people actually read it anymore?
Yeah.
And
Are you
and
in cursive or print?
cursive. Well, actually, what I write in is, and actually most people now do, is what I call cluster cursive, where you'll have some letters that are independent, and then you'll have two or three letters that are connected.
My mom's cursive is like that, or her handwriting's like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And I have learned so much about writing just by doing this, by writing. And again, I'll give you an illustration. This happened just this morning, and it was a fabulous discovery. So I'm working on this archives thing, and I'm going through their online training that tells you what they want you to do and how to do it. And at the same time, I have my moleskin next to me, and I'm writing about this process. And what I realize is that the process as it's presented, which is essentially there's a video or there's a whole series of screen grabs, it's really complicated. I mean, literally there's 12 screen grabs that talk you through how to actually get to the point where you're doing some transcribing. And maybe it's my generation, I think it is. I just found myself getting angrier and angrier and angrier. So there's a generational difference in learning where, and I've seen this in my students, I've seen this in my daughters, where you have a generation now that learns by click and see. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do this, etc. Whereas for me, it's like, explain it to me clearly. And if you don't explain it to me clearly, then I just want to punch the screen, right? So as I get more and more angry about this, because I'm thinking, how can I go through these 12 steps when I've got one laptop? Like, shall I try and call up on my phone so I'm following there, and then I can go through the steps on the file that they want me to transcribe, and just getting really, really frustrated. And then I realized that this was exactly the mirror image of the frustration of somebody 40 years younger than me who has great digital skills but can't read handwriting. It's like, how am I supposed to make sense of this? And so that's the digital divide. But the really interesting discovery I made was that what saved me was the fact that I was writing. Because as I was writing about this, it gave me a chance to create an alter ego on the page. Because on the page, I'm going, okay, breathe. And then I started writing out the instructions. So you're going to go to this and click on this. And that became, I actually call it alter scribo, from the Latin scribere, meaning to write. Yep. Because it was talking back to me and saying, you've got this, you can manage this. And seeing myself do this and hearing my own voice coming back off the page in my own handwriting had this really interesting calming effect. And it got me to the point where I was able to follow everything through. And then I could not believe this. When it came to the crucial screen grab that was going to say, you're now at this screen, this is where you want to be. Here is the original, here's an image of the original document. Here is the transcription box. And you're expected to say, so now all you do is you type out what is on this, and you type it on this line here, or you leave. There's no instructions for how to transcribe it. There's no instruction that says, this is what we want you to do. This is the important information. There's just a screen grab of the completed task, as if that explained everything. And then it says, now let's look at another example.
I would be very frustrated by that too.
Right. But it's that digital divide, because it's the assumption that all we need to do is to throw you a bunch of pictures and you're going to get it. But as I say, for me, the more interesting discovery was the value of the act of handwriting as part of this process. So there's lots of research that says that if you're attending a lecture and you have two people, one person who's got, I don't know, Otter going, or one of those other sort of transcription softwares, and one person who's taking notes, the person who's taking notes will understand and retain the information far better because you're processing it as it goes. And you, in order to write something, you have to understand it. It's like if you can only draw a bicycle if you understand how a bicycle works.
Okay.
And if, on the other hand, you're just taking everything down, like, for example, we're having this conversation, we're saying interesting stuff, I'm recording it. I haven't actually processed it. I'm going to have to watch the whole damn thing all over again and then take notes from that and then write something from that.
Yeah. That's interesting that you said that because there's so much there's actually quite a lot of research around the um like affirmations and positivity and stuff like that, and writing things down as a form of like manifesting,
Yep.
intention, and like making lists and like physically writing things down is used a lot in therapy
Yeah.
to, meet your goals and
Yeah.
become more focused.
And
And
as you know, I have a chapter on that in Writing Beyond Writing.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
a chapter about magic.
yeah, yeah, I
Which,
saw that and I was like, that's really on point. Like I do these things like, to keep on track and everything. So yeah, there is definitely an extra layer of retention that happens when you hear it and you write it down, because you're doing something, you're seeing it, and you're hearing it. So your three sensories are happening for that one piece of
yes.
information.
And I think there's actually something else. And this is another thing that I'm essentially researching by doing. So this is the research that I need to do. So if you know stuff that I can read about this, that'd be wonderful. So one of the things that people who write about writing don't understand and never get right is the elements of writing that have nothing to do with information retrieval and organization. So I've I've got any number of articles where that's how people who supposedly know what they're talking about uh, analyze writing. And yet, if you look at writers who've written about writing, Samuel Taylor Coleridge talks about the hot fit of composition. He's making a joke at his own expense, but he's essentially saying that it's a process over. It's almost like a disease. It's a process over which I have so little control. And if you ask the question, where do ideas come from? The fact is, nobody knows where ideas come from. Some of them, when you look at them afterwards, they say, oh, yes, someone said this, or you read this, or whatever. But at the moment, in addition to what you just said about the act of writing being, what it also does, um, and I know this because I do this all the time, is places it places what you're thinking about in an open field of association. I never had used that phrase before. So it's like you have a picnic and you go outside and you put it down and the wasps come, and the ants come, right? So what I'm fascinated by as a writer and somebody who thinks about writing is how so much of that is unpredictable. And so much of it comes from circumstances that actually involve you loosening your linear or logical flow of thought and allowing things to come in from other directions. So especially when I'm trying to explain something and I want sort of an image to, and again, an image is like that. It's an analogy that's come from one place and joined something else, then what I'll do is I will stop thinking in words and see if there is a feeling that throws up an image. Just as I did, with the field and the picnic, right? So we've all been on picnics. We know the ants, we know the wasps, etc. But a millisecond before I said that, that was not in my mind anywhere that I knew of. And so that process of opening this up so this thing comes to join it, and then looking at it and saying, does that work? Is this useful? Does it feel right, etc.? That is absolutely at the heart of thinking. And writing makes that more more possible, but only if you're writing in the right way. If you're thinking, I've got to write this damn paper. Just recently, I had to write a paper for about the stuff that I do, and I hated every moment of it because there was all of this shit that I had to get in there, and then I had to quote this person, and it was just about, information gathering and whatever. But writing that is original, writing that is you, as opposed to the annual report or whatever, is a different beast, and it's so connected with the physical embodiment of you in the process.
Yes, I love that. And so people look at me weird when I say this, but that phenomena that you're talking about there, I call it the muse.
Yeah, exactly.
My muse feeding me stuff. And so I was recently professionally employed as a technical writer, and I just hated it
Yeah,
because it was just not, the muse was nowhere involved. It was just information gathering and regurgitation. And but when I'm sitting down and I'm writing creatively, the things that pop out are, I'm just like, where did that come from? Okay, I'm going to go with it.
right. And every one of them is a
Wonderful. I love it.
reinforcement of your sense of your own value, right? Because in a sense, the best you can do when you're doing, as you were talking about technical writing, is to be a good servant to somebody else
Mhm.
or a good servant to the facts. And that only reinforces you to the sense that you want to spend your life as a good servant, right? Which some people do, right? But the notion that there is an infinite amount of possibility that you have access to, way more than most people realize, is, I think, one of the great hopeful things of being a human being.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's no comparison between the technical writing and the creative writing process when I'm doing something for me and for the sake of creating something.
Right.
It's just,
Right. And
it's,
that's why the digital tools, especially the AI, are applied, preferentially in the in that kind of format because people don't want to do it. And and
but you know,
also they're good at that. I mean, there's a lot to be said here, which I won't get into a lot, about the history of the order in which we invent things. So um, word processing is what our computers are good at. So if you have, as I had, all of these different bits and pieces, then kind of putting them all in order and just writing an and in between some of them, that's what it's good at. That would have taken me way longer, with paper and pen. But you got to ask yourself the question, why was that invented before a device which would engage handwriting? So everything begins with this kind of atomic segregation of characters into a keyboard. And so I'm imagining the ENIAC and the UNIVAC early computers of the like 1947, they're sort of breaking everything down. Here's a little hole on a punch card, everything is atomized, right? It's really broken down. And the assumption is that that's the best we can do because we're still barely above, relay on, relay off, relay on, relay off. And at some point, and I don't know my history yet, this is the research I'm doing, someone decides we really need to have voice recognition software because we have CEOs who want to dictate letters or, whatever. And So that voice recognition software, obviously it's still developing, but it's now been pretty mainstream and affordable for 5 to 10 years. Um, we've got optical character recognition, which was originally invented as a tool for the blind, bless them, in the 1970s, where it was connected to an audio output, which is great. But being able to input by writing or being able to read writing is obviously the end of the list of priorities. It's like put person on moon, develop rocket telemetry, have software that predicts market trends. This is where the money is, this is where the inventiveness goes. Um, and we actually have, going back to endangered alphabets now, we actually have cultures around the world who have a script which is sacred. And it is sacred in itself. It's not like the Bible, where, for example, the letters are not sacred, but the message is, right? These are ones where writing the letters is a sacred thing, reciting the letters is a sacred act. And as soon as you digitize that, you make it a secular act. You change the spiritual value of the script. And there are people who really don't want that to happen. But even so, even in scripts like Balinese, which is used for both sacred and secular purposes, the people who are really intent on the sacred nature of their script, which they describe as a form of visible yoga. They don't want their stuff to be on the internet because it's not just that it cheapens it, it's that it makes it something that no longer has a spiritual charge that we can't even recognize anymore. People who are really into traditional Hebrew and those writing traditions understand this in Western society. But by and large, as I say in Writing Beyond Writing, for us, it's linguistic duct tape. It does the job.
Yeah,
Get it done.
right. Yeah. Well, I mean, thinking about it too, like the whole purpose of that writing's existence, if you digitize it and put it online, is it's removed. Like
Exactly.
the purpose for it even being there is no longer valid. So, why put it on there? Because what does it become at that point? It's lost its meaning and its
Yep.
value.
Yep. Exactly so.
Um, so okay, you talked about this game that you created.
Glagolitic Abbey. Yes.
Glagolitic Hold'em. Yeah.
Oh, Glagolitic Hold'em. Yeah, that one. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I created a board game as well.
Oh, you did? Oh, awesome. Okay, so can I buy this somewhere? No, that's my first question. And the second question is, do you continue to use that game as a way to showcase the difficulty of minority groups being forced to learn a new language? Because I found just the struggle of English speakers trying to figure out how to win at this card game by creating words from a different script. I found that concept just absolutely fascinating.
Yep. Yep.
So
Um,
it's like a
yes.
one.
So I have a couple of different answers to that. One is I have published two books that go after the same aim. One of them is Endangered Alphabet Sudoku, and the other one is Endangered Alphabet's word search puzzles. And
Okay.
so both of them are intended to put the player, in that position you describe. Glagolitic Hold'em. It's a very sad thing in retrospect because I created that for a conference in San Jose right before COVID,
Mm.
and um, First of all, COVID stopped all the conferences. And the I had a certain amount of financial investment in that, which got lost. And I now have actually multiple games, which everyone thinks are absolutely wonderful, which I haven't been able to produce and market at scale because I don't have the investment capital. So there's Ulus Legends of the Nomads, which is our board game about Mongolian culture, which is just epic in every sense. And that is we sold a bunch of copies. We raised money through Kickstarter, but I just can't afford to produce them at a price point where I wouldn't lose money on every set. Glagolitic Abbey is a board game which is sort of a little bit like Clue, which is set in a monastery in Bulgaria in 1200. And it's a murder mystery. Um, I can actually send you the rules and the stuff for Glagolitic Hold'em, and that's something that I'm happy to make open source. Um, and there's a kind of another one that is sort of similar, which is called I can't even remember what I called it now. It's like a form of Scrabble,
Okay.
um, but it's a way of demonstrating how hard the English language is to learn for non-English speakers. And what it is you have a board and you have tiles just like Scrabble, and there's a first word that gets put down, and there's a particular word. There's a reason for it, and from then on, the players take turn, just as if it was Scrabble, kind of building words off of that. But the point of intersection between the word that's on the board already and the new word, the letter that they have in common has to be a letter that is pronounced in more than one different way.
Oh.
So if you had, let's say, the word stone, right? So there the O is pronounced O. So then the person going across could do H and T because in hot, the O is pronounced differently. It's not pronounced like an O, it's pronounced like an O. Um, and this is a really fun brain teaser. And when I invented it, we did some playing online and people went berserk with it, and created these entire massive boards of words that intersected at false friends.
That sounds like a lot of fun. It really. And so you use the English language for that, or you use a different language for that?
You could use any language as long as everyone was using the same language and as long as it used the Latin alphabet.
Okay.
Um, it's Scrabble becomes really hard when you start using different scripts because other scripts are much more specific in terms of what a letter means. Scrabble is actually only viable because our alphabet is so sloppy and can be used in individual letters can be used in so many different ways.
Mhm. Yeah, that game sounds like a lot of fun. Okay, so my last question is, and it goes back to the cursive discussion that we were having.
Huh?
Um, so your discussion is not necessarily, you know, about using it as communication anymore because that's being phased out. But as an expression of individual identity. And I love how you mentioned the cluster cursive
Cluster
writing,
cursive.
how that's so unique to you. So given this debate about whether we should teach cursive today, do you think that if it's not taught anymore, that it will institute a break from our ancestors, since, as you mentioned with the Smithsonian, that we will lose that knowledge base if we can no longer translate those letters and those documents written in cursive? And do you feel like this is like reversible? Like can we save ourselves from this?
Yeah, yeah, those are the questions everybody wants to know the answers to, including me. So I've been doing quite a lot of talking with calligraphers recently. Had a great session with the Chicago Calligraphy Collective a couple of weeks ago. And one of their members pointed out that when photography was introduced in the 19th century, everybody thought it'd be the death of painting. And it wasn't. But it was the death of commercial painting in the sense that there are so many things that could now be represented with a photograph that presumably but that previously either couldn't be represented at all, or you would have to get an artist to go and paint something or sketch something or whatever. So I'm now asking myself, what kinds of realm of writing are likely to continue? And what kinds of realm or activity are likely to shift entirely over to the digital realm? And when I said writing, just then I meant handwriting. And about 3 weeks ago, I was in Brooklyn, and I went to this great stationery shop where they have this amazing high-end paper and these fountain pens that go up to $8,500. And they have just these really interesting imported Japanese pencils and whatever. And one of my reasons for going there was to buy myself a calligraphy pen. And one reason was just to find out a lot more about whether people were actually still using this stuff. And the place was packed. But it was packed, and it was packed with younger people. I mean, an age range, yes, but not the kind of like NPR audience age range. Um, and heavily skewed towards people, I would say, between 18 and 35. So I thought, well, this is really interesting. Now let me look at what they are buying. Um, and I'm only working from my impressions because I have an interview set up with the owners, but they've just had a baby, so that won't be for a while. So then I'll know what people are buying. But what people were buying was the fun stuff. So this is colored papers, colored markers, things that you can use to personalize something where the quality of your handwriting is less important than the caring that goes behind it. So, again, if someone's just had a baby and you want to drop them a note and you send them a gift and then you put a tag around the gift, you're going to handwrite that tag. And you're going to do it in cluster cursive, probably, and you're going to do it in some kind of cool marker that is the writing is like both blue and silver or something like this. So I don't see that going away because it is so hands-on. It has such an important role in our society. People I know who are professional calligraphers are still being hired to write wedding invitations or place notes for weddings, or there is still this kind of ceremonial quality associated with it. I think that it's actually going to be much more like what happened with the printed word with the advent of the internet. So all of the stuff that was essentially routine and pragmatic could be done quicker and cheaper online. And so advertising flyers and newspapers, for example, they're on cheap paper. You're only getting your news 24 hours late. There's not much of a justification for them. But at the other end, high-end magazines are actually doing okay, or not nearly as badly as everyone thought they would. Art books, coffee table books, So um, the art object is not affected by the fact that just like painting and photography, the art, painting as art object is still going, even if it is now more into that particular bracket. What's what has been taken over is if something is of relatively little emotional importance, if it can be done cheaper and quicker, stored more easily, and broadcast to more people, then people are going to go that way.
Yeah. But thinking about like cursive itself
Hmm.
versus just handwriting,
Yep.
like, do you feel like we should advocate more for keeping that as an instructional thing in schools? Like,
Right.
so I have three kids. My son is in first grade this year, and I don't think they're teaching cursive in first grade. I don't know if they're teaching cursive at all at his school, actually. But like, do you feel like it is something that as a society we should be advocating more for?
So I have to tell you that I have never given a talk about the endangered alphabets where somebody hasn't asked me that question.
Oh, really?
Right. And in a way, the book I'm working right now is a direct response to that question.
Okay.
So first, there's several things about this that are much more interesting than they seem at first glance. So the word cursive is only used in the sense that you use it in the United States. Um, yes, it's a term that was introduced, I believe, in the 16th century in Italy for a particular kind of writing. It has broadened out more than somewhat, but essentially what people mean by it in the United States is Palmer method handwriting. And there are plenty of other methods of handwriting, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. In England, writing what's called joined up writing is actually in the national curriculum. There's stipulations as to what kids need to be able to do at what age, and that's true in other countries as well. So in this sense, what you're seeing is the US in this race over the cliff. We want to be the first to lose this. Um, the other thing is that when I talked to the Chicago Calligraphy Collective, I asked them, is cursive the gold standard? Because when we think of calligraphy, which literally means beautiful letters, then it turns out different people think of different things. And I realized that I had been conflating calligraphy with penmanship. Um, and having a neat hand or whatever. So I said, is calligraphy the gold standard? And my friend, who's the head of the guild, said, not at all. So what those calligraphers are doing is a wide variety of things, following their own training and also their own individual sense of what looks good. To be honest, the person who's throwing the wedding doesn't care what kind of handwriting is used for the invitations as long as it looks nice.
Mm.
So it could be a real copper plate, or it could be a Palmer method, or it could be what I think of as art director handwriting, where essentially each letter is separate but very carefully formed. So it's perfectly legible, but there are no ligatures or connections whatsoever. So when people say, what's going to happen to cursive? Are they teaching cursive in my school? They're asking actually a bunch of different questions without realizing it. And If you were to say, turn it around and say, what are you afraid of?
I think I'm afraid of that break from historical documentation, that
Yeah,
break this is our story, this is our heritage.
right.
And without that knowledge of how to read it and how to interpret cursive and handwriting script, you have to rely on someone else to tell you what it says.
Not only that, but one of the other things I've realized by writing this book by hand is that you're only going to learn how to read it by learning to write it.
I still,
And
I don't, well, some of my first memories was like doing the cursive letters in this little workbook that my mom got me.
yep, yep,
Do the little letters and
that's right.
yeah.
And so if you take that the next step further, you could say, is it, let's imagine a future in which all the people who don't like writing because they've never been introduced to writing for enjoyment, and they don't like their own handwriting because they've never really put the time and effort into discovering what feels right and good and looks good for them. Um, and then a second group where they love writing by hand and they love beautiful handwriting, all this kind of stuff. So if one of those groups um, takes a year of cursive in, I don't know, second grade, no, let's say both of them take that year of cursive. And some of them say, this is not for me. I hated the whole thing. I'm going to spend the rest of my life, on my devices. And the other group says, oh, this is cool. I really like doing this. I'm going to write to my friends and we're going to make up our own language and all this kind of stuff. Is that a bad outcome? Is it an inevitable outcome? Because the fact is, the number of people who know how to teach anything well is quite small.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find bizarre in the United States is the fact that it seems to have been culturally accepted that math is difficult and it's okay not to be able to do it. And that's a cultural thing. So in other cultures, there are people who are better at math than other people, but they don't say, "Oh yeah, I can't do that." That's just phew. And the fact is that most people can do the math they need to know how to do. They can figure it out. The fact they can't do algebra or trigonometry may not be particularly significant. The number of teachers who know how to inspire everybody into number is about the same as the number of teachers who know how to inspire everybody into writing. And it's not a fair question because they've actually tried. There are a number of states now where cursive, whatever that is, has been reintroduced to the curriculum. But the fact is, some teachers don't know how to do it. And so they give them the workbook and they say, yeah, close enough. And some teachers love it, and they say, yeah, let's have a great time. Let's do all this. Let's put these posters up on the wall. It's not something that you're going to be able to legislate.
Yeah. That's that's a good point. That's a very good point.
But I do think that writing should be taught in art class. And I do think that abandoned buildings should be given over to graffiti artists who have squatters' rights. Because graffiti is actually a really interesting extension of whole body writing.
I love that idea. I every time I go drive by a building that has graffiti on it or like these big murals or like any sort of art form, I'm always in awe of how cool it looks. So I I agree with that. That would be awesome. I
In Germany, you can. I was actually just our Discord channel talks about these things, and one of our correspondents in Germany said that yeah, there's uh, if there are abandoned buildings, then you have the right to use them as like mural surfaces.
That is awesome. I love that. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tim. I have really, really enjoyed this conversation. This might be the longest book club discussion that I have posted because I've enjoyed this so much. Can you tell our watchers how they can get involved with the Endangered Alphabets Project and where they can go to learn more about your projects that you're working on and how to get involved with saving endangered scripts?
Great. Yes, anybody is welcome to email me through the contact form at endangeredalphabets, all one word.com. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and Blue Sky and Instagram, and they're all some variation of endangered alphas, endangered alphabets, etc. And I absolutely welcome comments and discussion. I also have a discussion group that meets every 2 weeks on Sundays. And people can contact me and ask how they can sign up for that. There's actually a recent blog post about it at endangeredalphabets.com. Click on the blog link. And yeah, we're going to change the world.
Absolutely. And if you purchase the book through the endangeredalphabets.com, all the proceeds directly go to supporting this project and supporting endangered scripts as well. And I will be linking your website in the comments section for everybody to be able to navigate to your page and see those links and everything. So thank you again. So this was an amazing discussion. Please let me know when your new book comes out because we need to do a SASA Live Book Club part 2.
Brilliant. I will. I will.